my friend Stephen Holley. It hadn't been that long since I've seen you, but it's been a while since we sat down behind a microphone.
It has been a while. I'm thinking, I'm kind of right here at the point of this table. You think you move this way or this way?
You move wherever you want. This is your
no,
world.
This is your podcast.
I'm just playing in it. So actually, no, the last time we got behind the microphone was just over a year ago, probably. It was you, me, and Clint. We were talking about...
That would have been a year and a half ago.
Was it a year and a half ago?
Yeah, that was right. That was May, a couple months into the pandemic.
Yep.
It was in my backyard.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And a lot has happened since then.
A lot has happened.
A lot of good, a lot of trial and error, some not so good in the world.
But as it relates to this podcast, where was that in the sequence of you starting to roll this out?
I would say it was about a quarter of the way in, maybe a third, and I always prefer to do in person. Because we're social animals. There's nothing like looking somebody in the eye. It's a lot different than looking at someone on a video. And so that was really one of my more enjoyable episodes for that reason, because we got to sit there in person. And so, yeah, I'm excited to sit here in person with you again, because there's a lot to talk about over the last year. I mean, obviously Carry the Load's 10th anniversary. And it's weird to call it an anniversary given the magnitude of what Carry the Load does. But there's a lot that's happened over the last year. Our 10th year, we've seen a lot of impact. A lot of impact that can be measured, a lot of impact that can't. We could talk numbers all day long, and we've done a great job as an organization. You and Clint started something that resonates with people differently than just seeing a commercial on a TV. And, like we try to tell people, in order to fully understand Carry the Load, you have to show up. I don't want to talk about the numbers, though. I want to talk about the impact that this organization has had on other people that you've seen. And I also want to talk about the impact on Stephen Holley.
Okay.
So when you talk about the impact that you've seen this have on other families, is it in line with what you thought it was going to be, with what you were trying to do when you started it?
Yes and no. I think, at the beginning of this, it was about showing these families that there was people out there that wanted to honor their family members' service and ultimate sacrifice. And so obviously we've been able to do that and amplify that and grow that in a number of different ways. But ultimately that growth, we never could have imagined that it would have taken the scale that it has here in the last 10 years. And the stories that are really immeasurable, that happen year after year after year on ways that we've impacted those families. And one of the things that I was thinking about on the way over here that, this started from a place of some pain, losing personal friends and wanting to honor and remember them. But you also got to, there was a point a few years ago that kind of took me off guard, if you will, and that was, and it had to do with a family that's a good friend of mine. But we were filming a segment, and in the post-production portion of looking at a draft of this video that we were going to put out, it dawned on me, and we talked to the family about it, obviously, but it dawned on me how how painful does this have to be for them to relive this story again? And so, and I called them up and asked them about it, and they were very gracious about it and very appreciative of the effort to, kind of memorialize this story in a way that can, one of my good friends' kids, who now I think they've shared with me, it's an annual tradition as these kids are fairly young right now, but they're starting to understand the sacrifice that their uncle made. It's something they, it's something they look forward to every year, to be able to sit down and watch this video as those kids get older. But I also, again, phenomenal impact in telling these stories. But I don't know why I brought that up, but it was just on my mind on the way over here. As we get further and further down the road, there's also an element to just being very considerate about how we go about it. Because, again, these families are living with, just the worst situation you would ever want to, that you could ever imagine encountering, and losing that loved one. So,
yeah, but you talked about, you brought up the point, how difficult must it be for them to relive it? One of the things that I've found through doing this podcast is that very oftentimes it is more cathartic than anything else. Now,
understood, and that was always my assumption as we started and we got going in. But I also have had feedback over the years from families that have said, you know what, I'm going to pass. Mm-hmm. It's just, I appreciate what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, but there's still a lot of pain there, and
well, everybody has to deal with their pain in their own way.
Yeah.
For some people, it's like we just said, it's cathartic. For some people, it is painful, and I think the fact that we are continuing to hold their loved ones out front, and really show them, not just say it, but prove to them through actions that their death mattered to all of us, and their life, more important than their death, mattered to us more than just their death.
Right.
So what about on you personally? How has this journey, this 10-year journey, because that's really truly what it is. And when you and I, first got to know one another, this organization looks very different from that point to now. So how has Stephen Holley changed?
I would tell you that 2011 was within 3 or 4 years of getting out of the Navy and getting in the commercial real estate business, focusing on raising a family, back here in Dallas. And I think we've talked about this, and I've talked about it, but there was a transition there that it was, personally with the family, 5, at that time it was a couple of kids into what is ultimately now 5, but being very happy at home, being very happy, in my marriage, and thinking professionally, I was very happy. I was at a phenomenal company, learning a business that learning a business that I'd always wanted to get into. But at the same time, there were some underlying issues that
there was something that wasn't quite fulfilling.
Yeah, there was. At the end of the day, I during that transition, I thought, you know what, if I can hit this number, compensation wise, professionally, then things will be all right. And then when that number came, and there was a hollow feeling there. I thought, okay, maybe it's this number, and not that those numbers were any big deal, but I figured out that there was something else going on there. And it was through, I really miss being in the Navy. There's a professional satisfaction that came from wearing your nation's uniform and the friendships that existed.
Sure.
And ultimately there was I always tell people there was a level of adrenaline there that you can't really match as a civilian unless you're doing something illegal. That's the way I
don't know what you do in your off time,
but I don't know. So there was a lot of different components to it, but I really missed it. And sure. I actually, at one point in time, this was probably 2010, maybe 11. I sat down with Molly, my wife, and said, what would you think about going back in the Navy? And we talked through it. She was going to be supportive of what we thought was in the best interest of our family. Mm-hmm. And I sat down with a good friend of mine he was the pastor at the church we were at the time, and he's still a great friend today, Richard Ellis. And I was talking to Richard about that decision, and he said, well, let me ask you a question. What made you get out of the Navy? And I may have told you this story before, mm-hmm. but he said, what made you get out of the Navy? And I said, I wanted to focus on being a dad, being a good husband, raising a family. And he said, so has that priority changed in the last 3 or 4 years? And I said, no. And that ultimately kind of got me reset on, that being the ultimate priority to having some fulfillment. And this is a very long answer to your question, but it was about that time that we started working on Carry the Load. We had this event. We raised money for these other nonprofits, both military, veteran, first responders. And it was through that effort of raising that money and being able to give that money away, that scratched that itch of being able to continue to serve.
Sure.
And so it was a, not that all those issues went away, but it was a big transition for me to being able to turn the corner and settle in, for lack of a better term.
So being able to scratch the itch of service to be above self kind of put it on hold. It didn't, knowing you, it didn't completely eradicate that need. And I tell people all the time, they ask me if I miss the Marine Corps, and I say, I miss it every day, but I don't miss one day of it, because there were some hard days. But, for all the reasons you mentioned, it's the camaraderie, it's the adrenaline rush. And I want to, prepare you. I want to talk about your friend, Brian Bourgeois here in a minute. Fast roping out of a helicopter, that's a rush that you can't get at the job now.
No.
But, making sure that at the center of everything we do, we went in, and while it may not have been our primary motivator, it ended up being service above self. It ended up being a greater cause than ourself. It sounds like you were still missing that.
Yeah, I think a greater cause, yes. But just as important to that is the commitment and the loyalty you have to those guys you were serving with. That for me made it really hard. The first SEAL that died in Iraq, I believe it was August of 2006, and I'd gotten off active duty just before that in 2006. And in my mind, there was some mental calculus of having done a few tours through Iraq and predominantly serving with guys on the West Coast over there. Although we'd had guys that were, blown up in IEDs, we had guys that were shot, but no one had died. And for whatever reason, that first, Mark Lee's, finding out that he had died in Iraq, it just something flipped in my head, and there was a lot of I wouldn't say it's guilt, but there was a lot of desire to be back with those guys that I've been serving with, because they were continuing to operate over there. And
so you're hitting on something
so,
that
but hold on, but so it is service to something bigger than yourself. But it was really a loyalty that I felt that there was some betrayal there for having gotten out.
and that's exactly where I want to go with this, because I think that is the great tug of war for each individual who is married with a family inside of the military, because you have this commitment to these guys to your left and right, but you got a commitment to the people at home, and that's a struggle. And just like you went to to your pastor, and I think he asked a great question. Is that still what you are trying to achieve? Being that great husband and father.
And one thing I'll say there, a lot of the guys that I served with were their third, fourth, fifth, sixth platoon, however long they'd been in operation, a long time, and a lot of them were married with kids. And so what I'm not saying right now is those guys didn't have their families as their top priority. They absolutely did. They were just able to manage it in a way that I couldn't see myself managing.
Whether you're in day to day or you're missing it and you're out of the service now, that tug of war is going to exist. It's going to exist for a while, because one of our motto in the Marine Corps, and I shouldn't say motto, but one of the things that people used to like to say was God, country, Corps. Those are your priorities. And I have thought about that many, many times. And I used to think, well, where does family fit into that? Because you can't exclude family from it, because the family is really the backbone of the Marine Corps.
Right. And
I always struggled with God, country, Corps. Okay, where does family fit into that? I'm not really sure. Maybe it's part of God. Maybe it's part of Corps, because, that's the family. But I mean, what you're talking about, again, I see, in retrospect, I have seen so much of that personal tug of war. I have this responsibility to these guys, but I have this responsibility to these people that I'm either related to by marriage or blood. And so ultimately you decided not to go back in. And I'm just going to ask you point blank, do you regret that decision?
No, hindsight being what it is, at that point in time we had 2 kids, and again, it was
only 2 of the now fire team reinforced Holley.
Right. And now, we added 3 more there in pretty quick succession. But I think that was God's way of telling me that the decision you made was for me the right decision. And we were blessed with 5 beautiful, healthy kids, and a phenomenal wife in so many ways that are immeasurable, and her support and the things she's done for me over the years. So it was absolutely the right decision.
Okay, so fast forward, you made the right decision by not going in, but yet you miss it every day. How did that transfer itself into some of the personal challenges that you've had? I mean, you knew that not going back in was the right thing. Did any of that, the fact that you didn't go back in, though, did any of that contribute to some of the personal challenges you've faced? And a lot of those challenges are challenges that we help people with and carry the load.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I realize I'm not asking a pointed question, but
yeah,
it's a major topic.
You bet. Before I go directly to your question, I'll also, to put a bow around the previous question as I'm sitting here thinking about it, you like to think you had an impact. That time in the Navy, you can point to things you were involved in that had a larger impact. And that's a part of missing the opportunity to be in those types of situations. Hindsight, looking back over the last 10 years, I think through the impact that Carry the Lotus had, and again, me being a very small part of it, but being involved in this organization and looking at the impact across the country with these nonprofit partners and these families and those that these nonprofit partners serve, the thousands and however many people that impact has had. That for me is God's way of telling me, yeah, you did some really great things and fun things that were very impactful in your time in the SEAL teams, but I think the breadth of the impact over the last 10 years has really solidified that it was the right decision to get out.
And I can see that.
So to answer your question, over the last 6-7 years, having struggled with anxiety and depression, and it's interesting. Prior to dealing with it personally, and I think a lot of people feel this way, but I didn't have a category for it. I couldn't wrap my head around specifically anxiety. Again, never had really dealt with it, and when I did, and then the subsequent depression, I thought I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, because for me personally, was completely unable to make decisions, unable and completely scared to make decisions. And so I was just frozen.
For fear that they would be wrong?
For fear they would be wrong. And a lot of this had to do with some professional decisions that I made to some risks I took professionally, starting a company. But all of a sudden, seeing the gravity of what could be some implications from those decisions and how it would affect my family,
right?
And that's what really that's what really got me. But again, having heard stories about people with depression not wanting to get out of bed or being disconnected, there were days that, again, my wife Molly was so patient with me, but it was everything I could do to get out of bed. And the highlight of my day was once I finally did get out of my bed, I was like, get your ass out of bed so that you can drive your two kids, your oldest two kids to school. At least be able to do that today. And I'll never forget, we live less than a 2-minute drive from my house to my kids' elementary school at the time. And that 2 minutes was like, how can I slow this down and make this an hour? Obviously, I couldn't do that, but that 2 minutes was phenomenal. I'd get there, I'd drop them off, and then it was like, okay, I got to go to work. And it was debilitating. And I've told a few people this story, good friends of mine, but I had someone else working with me at the time, and who was working his ass off, and I would go into the office, and in order to kind of save face with him, we sat in a room not much bigger than this, and he sat facing that wall on his computer. I sat facing this wall. And in my inbox, there was emails that I had to respond to and decisions to make that had financial implications. And I remember I would just kind of dummy type on the keyboard for hours at a time. And then it was time to go to lunch. I'd get in my truck and go drive around for an hour, just trying to escape. And there is no, there was no escape. The only escape I found during that period of time was when I went to sleep. Thankfully, I didn't have any issues sleeping, which I know a lot of people do. But that was where I could shut the brain off. So all that's to say is there was those periods of time for me kind of came and went over, really over about a 5-year period. It ebbed and flowed. Sometimes it would last 3 months. One time it lasted 7 months. But every year I thought, okay, I've been through this. I could kind of feel it start to happen. But every time you get to a spot where it was just think, how do you claw back from this? And I had another good friend who has been involved with this organization that had lost his son, and had been through a very traumatic experience, and then struggled, for the first time in his life as an adult, anxiety and depression. And he told me one day, this was after seeing a psychiatrist. He told me one day, he said, I know there's stigma around taking medication and getting help, but he said, and this is one of the strongest men you'll ever meet, but he said, don't be afraid to go get that help, and don't be afraid to take that medication, because it will help you once you find that right. It may take a little bit of time. And he said, it's not like the magic pill where you take it and you're going to feel better the next day. He said, what I can tell you from my experience is you will start in on that medication and with counseling as well, seeing a psychologist weekly. But he said, you won't feel it day to day, but in 30, 45, 60 days, you're going to look back on where you were and you go, you know what? I don't feel quite as bad as I did. And then another 60, 90 days, you'll look back and go, I don't feel quite as bad as I did. And that was the experience that I had. It was just very incremental progress that I couldn't measure daily, but I could measure it over a 3-month period. And slowly, able to climb out of it.
Do you feel like you're still having to acknowledge that it's there and continue to confront it? Or do you feel like that's in my rearview mirror?
No, because after my, the first real episode with it that lasted probably 8 months, coming out of it, thinking, okay, I know what that was all about. And that ignorantly, arrogantly, I thought, okay, that's in my rearview mirror. And then again and again and again, that cycle. So I will.
Is that because you came out of it and you hadn't really addressed it, though? You just kind of snapped out of it yourself?
No, I mean, it. When you say address it, there's things that you can always incrementally work on, but some of those issues are always going to be there. For me, it's a part of life.
And I'm asking these questions because, number one, I'm curious because I don't personally have that issue to deal with. We've all got our own issues to deal with, but that's not one of mine. And over the years, I have, anyone who knows me well, I have said that I'm embarrassed how I used to view certain things as it relates to what you're talking about, as it relates to suicide. I'm not wired that way, but I've come to understand it's real. I mean, here I'm sitting in front of a guy that has achieved things that many people, I mean, let's be honest, you've achieved some really great things, and I know you're going to shrug your shoulders. Oh, you are. You've played football at the Naval Academy. You've been in the Navy SEALs, and even though I'm Marine infantry, and I didn't always care for you guys, I've come to really respect the things y'all have done. You took a step in trying to start your own business that a lot of people they would have been too scared to take. So,
yeah, now I understand why.
Fair, but you're just to finish that thought. If this guy that's sitting in front of me has done all the things that you've done, you have faced down death on the battlefield, you have faced your own demons personally, you can still have these challenges. I think what it does is it says to the common guy, the common gal, it's not abnormal. So don't think that you're abnormal. In fact, I may be more abnormal that I don't even think along those lines, which scares me because that means I'm pretty numb to certain things. But
I'm as common as they get. I can be, I always tell people get through. If I was stubborn enough to get through buds, you just you just keep going.
Stubborn.
Yeah, you just put your head down and keep going. But, you know, I don't know if this is part of your question, but it goes back to your question about is it in the rearview mirror? I don't think it'll ever be in the rearview mirror. And I don't think it's healthy for me to think it'll ever be in the rearview mirror. It's always healthy for me to know that that it's there. And if there's an awareness that it's there, there's the ability to manage it in a healthy way.
I like
Because
that.
there's a lot of ways to manage it, and again, I experienced some of those ways to manage it in very unhealthy ways. But having the awareness that it's there is good for me. And so,
was there a cause of it? Did you ever figure out? Was there you know? And I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I think it's fascinating.
I think mine was a lot of different. Again, I talked about, you know, turning that corner with Carry the Load and some of the issues of guilt, sadness, and then you layer on some of the things that was going on professionally as an entrepreneur when you start a business and, you know, you start swimming in deep water by yourself. And again, for me, there's always an element of me that wants risk, and being able to manage it, obviously manage it appropriately with a family. But that was a big catalyst for me, was being in a position and the ramifications that it was going to have on a wife and 5 kids. And as shallow as it sounds, it was, all right, I just took a risk, and it looks like we're probably going to lose our house. Maybe my kids are going to have to go to different schools. The vehicles in the driveway, maybe we're going to have to sell those. Like it, at the end of the day, that's not something that's fun to go through, but
those are all things you can't take with you.
exactly. And you know, a phenomenal woman standing by my side no matter what, and 5 kids that I don't care.
And you've said that 3 times now, and I want to reiterate. I'd like to think I'm a pretty good judge of character. Molly is just one of the quietest yet
very strong.
Very strong. And when you're around her, she doesn't say much, but she doesn't have to. And she's one of those people that, in my opinion, she speaks with her smile. And again, I don't know that I would have noticed it had I not been around you as much as I have. But I give you a lot of credit there, and you know, I think you're wise to acknowledge her.
Well, she gets the credit there. But at the end of the day,
but you recognized it and asked her to marry. I mean, come on, let's.
Exactly. Well, what you learn when you're married, every day that goes by, every year that goes by, you know, you figure out more and more reasons how much you love your spouse.
Yes.
You know, as life gets thrown at you, and that's certainly true with my wife. The loyalty, the strength, everything that she's done for me. So, at the end of the day, all these things that society tells us are important, especially living here in Dallas, Texas, and you know, it's easy to get caught up in it.
Yeah, and we're both native Dallas, but
you know, and coming from, you know, a great family. Molly comes from a great family. Feeling like, all right, I'm going to disappoint everybody, but at the end of the day, what's really important is you know, that relationship with Molly and the kids, and ultimately the relationship with God.
Yes,
that's it. The rest is gravy. And that's easy to say. It's harder to live that out.
It is. It is. There are a lot of things. I think you hit it on the head. There are a lot of things that are easy to say, but you know, living those out day to day, ensuring that you're doing right when nobody's looking. You know, the integrity that we learned was so important in the military. I think that in and of itself puts a lot of pressure, because it's real easy to to espouse those words oftentimes, but living it, and you know what, we're fallible people. I mean, we're human beings, therefore we're fallible in and of itself. But I want to kind of go in a different direction here. And
before you go there, I just want to say one more thing. And I reference, the relationship with God. Being almost a couple of years removed from having to wind down that business and kind of transitioning back into the commercial real estate business.
Has it been 2 years already?
Coming up.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on 2 years of pandemic. That was kind of the catalyst but God used that experience with me and, ultimately my family, and looking through the rearview mirror, it was the best thing that I think could have ever happened. Based on where I am today. And that's not to say life is all roses, but it's pretty interesting to look back and to see how he used that experience. And I heard a quote, golly, last night I was watching Ken Burns' documentary on baseball.
Oh, I love that one.
And I'm trying to think, it was, they were going from player, they were talking about Ichiro and they were talking about his dad. I'm going to get this quote wrong, but it was very impactful. His father had these 4 tenets that he lived by, and he said, in life, son, adversity will lead you to persistence, and persistence will ultimately lead you to success. But the key is that adversity.
Yes.
And man, that smacked me in the face last night listening to that, going, God, that is so true.
Well, we learn way more through failure and adversity, way more.
Yes.
And I think, you're talking about that, and that for some reason triggered a thought in my head about, you're a little younger than me, but I think when I was in high school or just starting out in high school, there was that guy, Todd Marinovich, or maybe I was in college at that point.
Yeah.
And I remember the Sports Illustrated article where his dad's talking about, he's never eaten a cheeseburger from McDonald's and all these things. And it was like, this kid has never failed and he will never fail. And I'm like, well, then that kid's very, very in a box and won't learn. And I thought that at the time instinctively, but I didn't understand what I was thinking. Now I look back on it as a wise old man, and what you said is absolutely on point. And that's one of the things that I always have tried to impart upon my kids, anybody that I work with. Failing is okay. It's not eternal. Failing is an episode. It's not a finite threshold that you cross. And so I love what you said there. Adversity, and whether it's a quote or a paraphrase, adversity leads to perseverance, which ultimately leads you where you want to go.
Yeah, and as I think about it in the context, and you hit it on as a father, there's a very delicate line there that you want the best for your kids, but at the same time, having them experience situations where there is adversity, and so they can, at a young age, learn how to appropriately persevere. I think that's very important. And again, that's a delicate line between when you let your kids, stump their toe, and when you step in to not let them stump their toe. So Anyway.
So I want to talk about 2021, and I mean, there have been a lot of things that have happened. We certainly, and I think it all kind of, I'm going to tie this back to carry the load as well, but nationally, we look at some of the things that have happened. I mean, obviously the COVID epidemic has continued to be a topic of conversation regardless of where you stand on it. We've now seen people going into outer space, not necessarily to the moon, but we've seen private organizations go into outer space, and, celebrities and William Shatner. I mean, that's, who would have thought we'd see that type of stuff? But then there's the other side of things. Back in January, we had and I don't want this to go in a political direction at all, but back in January, we saw ordinary citizens breached the Capitol, I should say. We got out of Afghanistan. And where I'm going with this is, as a guy who used to put the uniform on every day, especially Afghanistan, pulling out of Afghanistan, and I still have that picture of that young Marine pulling the baby up over the wall. What goes through your mind as someone who felt, okay, when I had the uniform on, I knew I was making a difference. I knew I was making an impact. You see things like that. Does that change that impact and that feeling of doing some good?
No, it doesn't. Obviously this is an apolitical organization here with Carry the Load, but personally, I would have liked to have seen when we're talking about Afghanistan handled differently. And I say that in the context of I never set foot in Afghanistan, but again, a couple tours in Iraq. And on my first deployment over there, this was 2004. We just captured a guy at night, and we brought him back to the detention center where we were kind of doing some in-processing. And I was standing outside waiting for that to be done, and I was standing next to one of our interpreters. And he was a guy, based on my understanding, that had grown up in Iraq, and then at some point in the last 20 years, he had gotten into Syria and made his way into Europe, and then ultimately ended up in Chicago, and had been in I want to say in the mid-'80s, he got to Chicago, and he said, it took me 4 years living in your country in Chicago, because I kind of asked him, what do you think about all this and us being over here? And he said, you got to understand that it took me 4 years living in an apartment in downtown Chicago to figure out that no one was going to kick in my door at night for something that I said or my family said and drag my family away. And he said, it took me 4 years living in your country to figure out really what a democracy and freedom and what those tenets are all about, those ideals are all about. So if it took me 4 years living in your country, then you can imagine what it's going to take for the folks over here that are trying to establish some of those same ideals in the midst of what was a civil war. He said it is not going to be easy, and it's going to take a long time. And so, all that to say, I think we obviously, who knows? Again, I don't want to get political. I just would have liked to have seen it handled a little bit differently. And I think, there's a long-term view there that I think a lot of people lose sight of. And, going back to World War II, you look at where our bases are today in Europe, in Japan, and in other strategic parts of the world, there's a reason why we're still there.
Sure.
And again, I'm not advocating for sustained combat for the sake of having sustained combat, but being able to strategically look at some foundations that have been laid in that country and maybe, again, how could we have handled that a little bit differently?
Well, and really and truly, when I'm asking this question, I'm curious from the standpoint of this is, and you pointed out we're an apolitical organization, and that's one of the things that I always tell guests on this show. This is not, I don't want to be political, but there are things that happen that cross over into the political realm as well as the military realm. And what I heard more than anything, the outrage that I heard from certain people, it was all military guys that, well, I shouldn't say that, vastly It was military guys that were upset about us pulling out of Afghanistan. And the reason is because all of a sudden there becomes a question mark of why their friends died. Now, it's really easy to debate this and be right, and it's really easy to debate this and be wrong. So from your standpoint, did that ever cross your mind? Why did my friends have to die?
Yeah, yes, for sure. But that's a very valid question and should be asked. For me personally, that's a slippery slope to go down for me mentally. But again, it's a very valid question, and one that should be debated and should be answered. Again, it all goes back to, I wish it was handled differently.
So,
and again, I think there's obviously, there's the question of what was the meaning of those deaths, and I think there's another question of all the people that live in that country that put their lives on the line to help in so many different ways over the last 20 years, whose trust we had to gain. And again, the way it was handled, I think it sent a different message than the one that I would have wanted to send, the way we handled that. And not only for those people that continue to live there, but if you look at, other countries that, how they view us being the United States.
right.
And the long-term ramifications of that. Again, those are the things that I think about.
Yeah, and it's a tough question to answer, and in some ways it's a tough question to ask, because as two guys who swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States, our job was not to question those decisions. As civilians, we have not only every right but every responsibility to question decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned the Capitol because I think we have, as civilians, the same responsibility to ask of our fellow Americans. I look at what happened there. I look at what happened in Afghanistan, and it's real easy for everybody to focus on Afghanistan and Iraq are in the past. War's over. It's real easy for everybody to focus here internally. But then now we look at the military goes on. Brian Bourgeois, a friend of yours, recently perished in a training accident. I would imagine, because if I'm not mistaken, y'all played football together.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, he was a year behind me at the academy. So we played. We were on the team 3 years together. Phenomenal guy, great ball player, phenomenal husband, father. Again, you can read a lot more about this than just what I'm saying, but phenomenal husband, phenomenal father, phenomenal football player, and phenomenal SEAL officer.
So I preface all of that to really ask two questions. Number one, what do you say to the American public who thinks that war is in the rearview mirror? And number two, how has Carry the Load, how has the things that we've done as an organization helped you to deal with the death of a close friend like Commander Bourgeois?
I think it's short-sighted to say war is in the rearview mirror. The nature of conflict I think, has forever changed. You know, when you look at where we were in World War II and in Vietnam, and the way that conflict has evolved, you know, over those decades, but specifically over the last 20 years, I don't think it'll never going to be in the rearview mirror. There's always going to be things that are going on. It's just it's a matter of the scale with which it's going on. The other thing I don't know why it popped into my head, but I think it's very hard, if not impossible, for the average person living in this country to wrap their head around. And again, this is not a blanket statement, but we saw it more often than not. And again, speaking from a perspective in Iraq, but knowing that it was there in Afghanistan as well. But there's a level of evil that exists. Mm-hmm. People, it is very hard as an American who goes about their day-to-day life here and to wrap their head around what that looks like, what that feels like. Just very, very evil people in this world. And I bring that up to say, we don't have to, very rarely do we see something that grotesque here. And maybe it's a serial killer, you know, I won't go down that road, but the frequency with which we're exposed to it is very, very little.
Right.
Whereas over there it was daily. And so when people say, you know, if we get out of there and no one's ever going to bother us, let's just bring everybody home and go on about our way. It doesn't.
It's a little naive.
From my perspective, it doesn't work like that. And so I think it's very hard for us here as Americans to wrap our head around what that looks like in some of these other countries, if you haven't experienced it. And that's also to say, thank God we live in a country where we don't experience it. But again, it all goes back to your question about is war in the rearview mirror? No. So the second part of your question, you know, how does it? Obviously, his death is tragic, sad. Again, phenomenal guy. And I was reflecting back when I got the initial email that an accident occurred, and then subsequently about a day later an email that he had passed. I went back through my phone to try to look up some text messages that we had exchanged here in the last few years. You know, it's again, there's just I don't feel bad for Brian per se. Obviously, it's part of the risk of that job. Just heartbroken for his family and his wife and his kids and you know, his friends. But obviously, first and foremost for his family, and obviously, you know, for the men that were a part of that unit there at SEAL Team 8. Feel for them as well. So as it relates to carry the load, and I take comfort in the fact that we raise money and give to organizations that are in a position to support families that have to go through a tragedy like that.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this not too long ago. It's going to be real easy for a lot of people who have been involved in carry the load to say, well, the wars are over, because they're not being reported on every day or every night. But the effects of war, the wake of these wars, will go on for quite some time. And as we have said many times, for most of America, Memorial Day is one day a year.
I think we're starting to hopefully make it a little bit of a dent there on again, obviously awareness about that day, but as we continue to build out a calendar that's year long, hopefully there's a level of awareness that's growing.
No, there's no question there is, but for someone who's never lost a loved one, it's like an event like the Super Bowl. It comes once a year, whereas for the family of Commander Bourgeois and so many others, Memorial Day is not just a day on the calendar. It is every day you wake up.
Yeah, sadly, it's their reality.
It is. And
going
so
forward.
I think as an organization, personally, I think that is part of our goal, is to make people realize that it doesn't matter if there's a war being fought or not. He died in a training accident, but he died in anticipation of being available to protect us should we need it as a country. Do you feel like Carry the Load is equipped to continue for another decade to make sure that people understand these deaths, while they may be in training, still have an impact to everyday Americans and everyday life?
Absolutely. Whether it's in training or whether it's in, the conflicts that will, sadly continue, because there will be, again, who knows what the scale will be, but the war is certainly not over. There will be conflict going forward, because there's folks out there that want to kill Americans. I also think we're just now, again, I'm certainly not a doctor, but I think we're just now starting to see the tip of the iceberg of what these long-term ramifications of 20 years of sustained conflict looks like. And again, for every person that's gone through something like that, who's had that unique experience, it's going to manifest itself in different ways. We're all human, we're all different. So it's, again, that's one of the things that I've loved about Carry the Load and how it happened organically, was this broad continuum and these different organizations that serve in different ways, but they're all compatible with one another, all answering needs that are there. So I believe sincerely that Carry the Load will be as relevant 10 years from now as we are today. And that's because we're always going to have men and women willing to serve in the military, and we're always going to have men and women that are serving here domestically.
And willing to step in harm's way for somebody they don't even know.
Absolutely.
So you talked about continuum, and I think that's a really good segue into one of the things that.
Can I say one more thing? And I want to give.
It's your show. You can say whatever.
This is certainly your show, but again, going back to a quote that, coming off the heels of the Army-Navy game, whatever it was, about 10 days ago.
Yeah, you haven't bragged about that once, by the way.
I mean, try to be humble. Try to be humble. What a great game, though. But that was, obviously Brian was fresh in everybody's minds on that game, given the accident the previous week. But a quote that Clint, I'll attribute it to Clint, that I've heard him say before, that is so true on so many levels. But he was being interviewed at one point about, the fact that he was a collegiate football player and then in the NFL, and talking about different college football rivalries. Maybe you've heard him say this. it was asked, where does Army-Navy rank in the context of college football rivalries? And whether you're talking about Alabama-Auburn or Texas OU or Texas A&M, hopefully that will be back at some point. Clint said, I'd put Army-Navy in front of all those for the reason of give me another game where everyone playing the game is willing to die for everyone watching the game.
Mm-hmm.
And especially on the heels of what happened to Brian, that just came to my mind over the last 2 weeks, and as we're going into bowl season and college football playoffs, that's always at the top of my mind.
Oh, but it's so true. It's such a true statement, and the Army-Navy game may not have the flash of the spread offense and the West Coast offense and all that stuff, but it doesn't matter.
There's the pageantry around that game, if you've ever been to one. And sadly, in the last 20 years, I have not prioritized going back to watch one in person. The last one I was at was my senior year on the field. But the pageantry around that game and the intensity on that field is another level relative to the other, 9 games or whatever 9 or 10 game schedule you have. It's just something very unique. And we can get off Army-Navy, but I love what they've done here in the last, however it's been in the last 10 years when they've moved it to its own weekend. It's brought visibility to a very special game. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually this year too. I was like, wow, there is nothing else going.
Yeah, and I want to say
that's been happening for a few years.
It's sometime in the last 10 years. I can't remember when the decision was made, but certainly thinking back, fall of '99 and all the 4 previous years, thinking after the Army-Navy game, going back to the hotel, changing clothes before you go out to eat, you're always watching the TV because it was the conference championship weekend.
Right.
So it was one game and a slate of games, and now that they've moved it forward one weekend, I think it
has a different meaning.
It has, it certainly doesn't have a different meaning to those that participate in it. I think it brings a level of awareness and meaning to the rest of the country that wouldn't necessarily tune in amidst the other slate of games. So
yeah, I have to give the networks and maybe college football credit on that one. That was a good nod. I mean, assuming let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that it was intentional. You got to give them credit there.
Yeah.
So the other topic, the final topic that I want to kind of touch on is it can be a painful, morbid topic, and it kind of circles back to something we talked about at the very beginning, and that is those individuals who have difficulty dealing with the things that they did, they saw, they experienced. Veteran suicide is at an all-time high. You brought up the continuum of care, and that's one of the things that we as an organization are really trying to support from the standpoint of mitigating. And I don't know if we can ever eradicate that aspect. But the whole idea of veteran suicide continues to be a problem. I'm sure you've known a couple people as well who have taken their own life. Mm-hmm. As somebody who has been in combat, how do you relate to the challenges that they face?
Well, I think it goes back to it goes back to our conversation about anxiety and depression. You get to a point where, again, never having a category for it and then experiencing it. For me personally, I wanted to do anything I could to make it go away, and you can't. Again, outside of sleep was the only time I could get relief. But it is just it's the worst feeling in the world. And I can see where, again, I didn't understand suicide prior to having that experience with anxiety and depression. Sadly, I can see where that becomes a feasible option. Mm-hmm. It's a temporary solution. But in my own head, that for me was never.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by it's a temporary solution?
It's a temporary solution to a long-term problem, right? It provides some temporary relief to yourself, but the wake of...
But the effects are fatal.
Yeah.
Obviously.
The effects are fatal, but the wake of tragedy that it leaves around you with your family and your loved ones, and I've seen that up close as well, is tragic.
I used to think it was a very selfish act for that reason.
Exactly. But again, until you were in the depths of that depression, you anything you can do, it's almost, I almost equate it to just having just this immeasurable weight on your shoulders that you just think, how do I shake this thing off? And you can't. And so I understand that there's relief there. And that's going back to our conversation about, thankfully, having some people that I, love and respect that came alongside and said, hey, I've been where you've been, and here's how I've dealt with it. And here's how, just being there.
Right.
Being there and understanding that there's no quick fix, there's no easy magic pill, but it's just daily work. So again, for me, I think when people get to that place, it's I can understand the decision. I don't condone the decision, but I certainly understand it. I also think that it's very important to recognize, I think one of the contributing factors there is when you get to that point, for me, I was completely embarrassed. I didn't answer my phone for at some point 2 months straight.
I remember.
Someone leave voicemail. Very, very seldom did I call that person back. There was 3 or 4 people that I would pick up the phone for, because I was embarrassed about where I was mentally and physically, just in a bad spot. So luckily I had people come around me that had similar experiences and that were, for lack of a better term, they were just present. Not necessarily there to tell me how to climb out of it, but they were there knowing that as long as I was there, they're going to be sitting there with me, and they were there no matter what, any time of the day. And so that leads me into, I think people get to that point, and it is so hard to ask for help because your pride.
Yes.
Not necessarily the fact that you need help, but letting those close to you, around you, know that you've gotten to that point. Because when you're in that point, you cannot see how there's any conceivable way you're going to get out of that. And sadly, I've been on the other side of it here in the last year with another friend who I did not know was experiencing, again, a former SEAL, who I did not know was experiencing some issues until someone keyed me into it. And he had no idea of my experience, but they were very similar because they were both brought on by risks taken professionally and things not going the way you thought and the ramifications for your family. And again, this guy is, you want to look up SEAL officer stud, that's him. And he wouldn't call me back for a few days. And I stayed after him. We finally texted. And I didn't want to have to send a text that was that long, but he wouldn't answer the call. And so I finally sent a text I just gave him my story as briefly as I could, but it was an extremely long text message. And he called me back and he said, I had no idea. And it is a very similar set of circumstances. But what he said to me was, I don't see how I can climb out of this. And I said, I've been right where you've been. I understand that feeling, but know that you will climb out of it. It will happen. And at the end of the day, again, going back to my experience, your wife and your kids, they could care less about the professional ego hit that you've taken. And the world's not going to come to an end. But just it reminded me in talking to him just how desperate that situation is. So long answer to a short question. I think, anxiety, depression, I can understand it. People tend to isolate when they get there because they don't see how they can come out of it, and they feel like they're an embarrassment, a disappointment to family and friends. And
which couldn't be further from the truth.
Couldn't be further from the truth, but extremely important for those who maybe are keying in on some of those, signs of that, to just reiterate that and to be present. And again, I was very careful about trying to tell him what to do. It was more, here's what happened to me, here's what I did. I'm not telling you what to do, but no matter what, I'm just here.
Right.
If you want to talk, I'm here. And so
be present.
Be present. It's easy to want to offer a solution, which I think is very well intended, but your mind's so out of whack at that point that you can't make sense of anything.
Yeah, you're not thinking logically. You're thinking emotionally, or your thinking is just muddled. I would guess.
I was trying to explain it at one point to a friend of mine who, very successful entrepreneur, and I think the way I said it was, you come into a room and there's a jigsaw puzzle on the floor, and it's 1 million pieces. All right, it's going to be tough to put together, but you think, all right, put a plan in place, put a team in place. But the visual image was me personally. I'm staring at 1 million jigsaw pieces, but I'm going to be stubborn. I put my head down and start putting them together day by day, day by day. Well, all of a sudden, someone comes along and turns out the lights in the room, and you've got like 2 pieces together, and you've got 900,000 more to go, and you can't see them. That's what it felt like to me to try to. There's no way I can put together this jigsaw puzzle with the lights out. That's what it was like to think, how am I going to get out of this place of depression? You just feel hopeless. And that was the visual I gave to someone at some point was, you're working on a jigsaw puzzle and you're this much into it, someone turns out the lights. You think, I'm screwed.
And it ties directly into the veteran suicide problem that we face. And that a lot of those guys, that's where they feel like they are. And so, man, I appreciate that insight.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a big contributing factor as you get out of the Navy and you don't necessarily have that folks around you, that accountability, that camaraderie every day, and it's slowly, you just slowly drift, and then you look up one day and you've drifted and you're isolated and you're not in a good spot.
So the final thing I want to touch on is 10 years for Carry the Load. You feel like we're well equipped to handle things over the next decade. If you were to succinctly talk about a lesson you've learned through these last 10 years of Carry the Load, what would that lesson be that you learned?
The lesson I have learned, and again, this being really my first nonprofit experience as ultimately a volunteer CEO, I've been amazed at the folks that were involved very early on from a volunteer perspective. That here we are 10 years later, and there's a lot of the same faces that are very involved in differing capacities, from, leadership on the board like yourself, or there's a laundry list of folks like that in different volunteer capacities, and I'm amazed at it. But it goes back to something we said. I think all of those people, you want to serve, but there's this, it's the feeling of gratification that you feel when you see the impact that these organizations and these families, the impact that we are having through Carry the Load. I can understand why, we're all still here 10 years later.
Sure.
Just as excited about the next 10 years as we were when we started this. I think that's the biggest lesson is not only the external impact, but the internal impact as well.
So I think I would kind of summarize that in a quote from another guy who became pretty adopted Dallasite, and that was Zig Ziglar. He used to say, if you help enough other people get what they want, you're going to get what you want. And that's what you made me think of there when you said that. And I think, the whole idea of self-gratification, it's not that I'm going to be selfish, and Mother Teresa, all the wonderful things that she did for other people, she did it because there had to have been some gratification there for her personally. And so if I understood you correctly, the lesson you learned is that that's okay. It's okay to feel gratified by helping others.
Yes, it's okay. But the lesson I learned also was I never would have imagined the loyalty of a group of volunteers that we have, a lot of which have been there since the very beginning, that we still have today. I don't know if that's a lesson, but it's something that I've realized over the last
Lesson,
2 years.
observation, either way, it's pretty special.
Yeah, very special.
So, Stephen, Holley, thank you.
Todd, thank you for all your efforts, obviously over the last 10 years, but specifically here over the last 2 years with this podcast and the stories that you've been able to tell and the platform you've been able to build to give people not only an outlet to tell their story, but for all those that listen to be able to learn about what we're doing and just as importantly, these individuals that you're putting a spotlight on. So well done.
Well, thank you, sir. As we always sign off, I have to ask you the question. Who are you carrying?
Right now it's Brian and his family. Obviously they're top of mind, and I think there's obviously that family is receiving a lot of support right now in a lot of different ways. I think is, for me, to be cognizant as we get further and further away from that tragic accident, to make sure that there is an ongoing effort. And I think through some relationships that exist specifically through some former Navy football players, I think that the infrastructure is there to continue that support. But that's top of mind because obviously there's a spotlight on it right now in the media and within the community. But as we get further and further away, it's making sure that they understand that there's still emotional and financial support. So
one of these days we're going to, maybe sometime this year, we're going to have you and Clint on again, and we're going to go deep into the name of Carry the Load and the phrase, who are you carrying? Because I think that that's a very deep philosophical discussion, to be honest with you, because it means so much. But Stephen, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Stephen Holley, United States Navy civilian, SEAL, Naval Academy graduate, Dallasite, husband and father. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
All right.